Onto the conference. I'd like to just go very quickly through the program. For anyone who has the program, they were giving it out at the front, but if you don't have it, we'll just go through it very briefly. We are running very slightly late, but we will make up that time during speeches. We're going to start off with the first talk panel titled Balfour Declaration, Origin and Consequences, which will be done by Professor Avi Shlaim. He's a British Israeli historian and a professor of international relations at the University of Oxford. Please give him a round of applause and welcome.
Grateful to FOSIS for inviting me to participate in this very important conference on Palestine. Because as the President just said, the Palestinian cause is an important cause which is close to all of our hearts. 2017 is a year of anniversary. It's the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, the 70th anniversary of the Nakba, the 50th anniversary of the Israeli occupation of the rest of Palestine, and the 10th anniversary of Israel's imposition of the vicious blockade of the Gaza Strip. For me, this is the 45th anniversary as a university teacher. I was a young lecturer at Reading. And my first public talk was to the Fabian Society at Reading, and I shall never forget the introduction that I received from the chairman. He said, "I'm not going to give a long and boring speech, because we have Dr. Shlaim here for this purpose." In Oxford, we have just completed last night Israel Apartheid Week. It was the 11th Israel Apartheid Week at Oxford, and I participated in all of them. The overall theme of this last week was a century of settler colonialism, 1917 to 2017. And today I would like to talk within this framework on the role of British colonialism in the dispossession of the Palestinian people. And I'd like to begin with two quotes from two heroes of mine, Edward Said and Noam Chomsky. Edward Said wrote in The Question of Palestine, "The Balfour Declaration is a classical colonial document." And Noam Chomsky wrote that settler colonialism is the most extreme and sadistic form of imperialism. And the Palestinians have been victims of both. They have been victims of British colonialism as well as its ally, which is Zionist settler colonialism. So it's a double whammy. The era of European colonial control and domination of the Middle East was brief, but it was devastating in its impact on the region. The colonial powers denied the Arabs independence, freedom, and democracy. Albert Hourani called his most important book Arabic Thought in the Liberal Age. So there was Arabic liberal thought in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, but it was never turned into practice. There was never a liberal age in Arab politics, largely because the colonial powers did not allow it. The hallmark of British policy towards Palestine is duplicity. The French call Britain perfidious Albion, la perfide Albion, for very good reason, but the French are no better. The French were also ruthless and rapacious colonial power. In World War I, Britain and France promised the Arabs self-determination at the end of the war. The Arabs all yearned for self-determination, but it was denied to them by the colonial powers. In the course of the First World War, Britain entered into 3 commitments which were incompatible with one another. First, the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence, then the Sykes-Picot Agreement with France, and thirdly, the Balfour Declaration towards the Zionists. There is a huge academic scholarly literature about these 3 sets of documents, and they all focus on the text of the correspondence or of the Sykes-Picot Agreement or the Balfour Declaration, but today I'd like to focus not on the text but on the context. And the overarching context was that Britain was fighting a desperate war, global war, against 3 empires. And it was seeking allies in this world war. And to gain allies, Britain made different promises without thinking about the consequences of making these promises to prospective allies. And this is understandable given the circumstances, given the context, because if Britain lost the war, it wouldn't be called upon to fulfill its promises. But if Britain won the war, then, as Richard Nixon used to say, when we get to this bridge, we will double cross it. The first promise was made by Britain to Hussein the Sharif of Mecca. And the promise was that if he mounted an Arab revolt against the Ottoman Turks, Britain, at the end of the war, would support the establishment of an independent Arab kingdom under his rule. I stress independent Arab kingdom under his rule. The debate was on whether the British promise included Palestine or not. The British said it didn't include Palestine. Hussein the Sharif of Mecca was certain, and for good reason, that he had been promised Palestine as part of his kingdom. After the war, Britain reneged comprehensively on its promise to the Sharif, and it justified not giving him Palestine by saying it never promised Palestine. But the debate is largely academic, because Britain reneged on its entire promise, and there was no independent Arab kingdom. So it's a purely academic question as to whether Palestine was included or not. And when I say academic, I mean futile. The second agreement was between Britain and France, the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916. This was a secret agreement between the 2 colonial powers. It was not made public, because it was clearly incompatible with the promise that the British had made to Hussein, the Sharif of Mecca. The Sykes-Picot Agreement divided the entire Middle East into a French and a British sphere of influence. But the two powers couldn't agree about Palestine. Both wanted it, so it was not included in the zones of influence. It was to be placed under a separate international administration. The Sykes-Picot Agreement drew lines in the sand, completely arbitrary borders for the states, Arab states that were to emerge at the end of the war, lines in the sand which took no account of the natural divisions of the area into different tribes, different religious sects, different religions, and different ethnic groupings. Last year was the anniversary of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and there were a lot of television programs and articles about that agreement. Daesh, ISIS, issued a video clip under the heading "The End of Sykes-Picot," and in it they showed the blowing up of a border post between Iraq and Syria, and the banner said, "We've done away with Sykes-Picot." Well, the people who made that program were not historians, because had they been historians, they would have known that it wasn't Sykes-Picot and Picot who drew the borders of the Middle East, but the borders were drawn by the San Remo Conference of the League of Nations in 1920. The third and most famous document was the Balfour Declaration of the 2nd of November 1917. The Balfour Declaration promised to support the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. It was only 67 words long, but it had the most far-reaching consequences for the region, and today we are still grappling with the consequences of the Balfour Declaration. Arthur Koestler, the Jewish writer, summed it up by saying that Britain, one country, Britain, promised the country of another people, the Palestinians, to a third people, the Jews. The Balfour Declaration had no standing whatsoever under international law. The term national home didn't exist under international law. It was a British invention. But as far as the Zionists were concerned, they thought that there was a clear promise to support a Jewish state in Palestine. In 1917, the Jews constituted just under 10% of the population, and the Arabs constituted 90% of the population of Palestine. And the Balfour Declaration included a caveat that Britain would support the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people, provided it did not violate the civil and religious rights of the non-Jewish communities. So the minority of 10% were accorded by Britain national rights, and the 90% were denied national rights. They were only allowed individual, civil, and religious rights. And look at the terminology. The non-Jewish communities in Palestine. So as Edward Said said, this was a classic colonial document which completely disregarded the rights and the aspirations of the indigenous population. There is a famous memorandum that Lord Balfour wrote years later, and I'm sure that Carl Saban is going to quote it, so I'm not going to quote it to you. But the memorandum said that as far as Palestine is concerned, no statement of fact made by Britain was true, and no promise that it made they ever intended to fulfill. So there you have it from the horse's mouth. A supreme example of British duplicity. But Balfour wasn't the driving force behind the Balfour Declaration. The real driving force was David Lloyd George, who became Prime Minister in late 1916. David Lloyd George was a Welsh radical in British politics, in domestic politics, with very important achievements to his name. But in foreign relations, he was an old-fashioned British imperialist and a land grabber. And in particular, he coveted Palestine. He wanted to include Palestine in the British zone of influence, and therefore he started sliding away from the Sykes-Picot Agreement. He had two reasons to do with geopolitics for the Balfour Declaration. One is that he wanted to set a limit to British influence, to French influence in the region. He didn't want the French to have any influence further south than Lebanon and Syria. And secondly, Palestine straddled the access to the Suez Canal, so he wanted Britain to control Palestine in order to control the imperial routes of communication to India. But he had a third and the most important motive for the Balfour Declaration, and that was his image, his perception of the Jews and their international power. There is a very good book on this, on the mindset of Lloyd George, and it's by an Israeli historian, Tom Segev, called One Palestine Conflict, the One Palestine Complete. And Segev shows in his book that Lloyd George's support for Zionism was based on ignorance and prejudice. In aligning Britain with Zionism, Lloyd George acted in the mistaken and possibly anti-Semitic view, which held that the Jews were uniquely influential in international affairs, that the Jews made the wheels of history turn, and therefore, if Britain made this gesture to them, it would acquire a really important ally with a lot of influence internationally, but especially in Moscow after the Bolshevik Revolution and in Washington. The truth of the matter was that the Jews were a helpless minority with nothing to offer except the myth of international Jewish influence. The Jews were a helpless minority, and not all Jews supported Zionism by any means. The Zionists were a small minority within the Jewish minority. There was one Jewish member of the war cabinet, Sir Edwin Montagu, the Secretary of State for India. And interestingly, Montagu opposed the Balfour Declaration. And his reason for opposing it was that if there is a Jewish state in Palestine, it would undermine the struggle for equal rights for Jews in Britain and in the rest of Europe. Because if there is a Jewish state in Palestine, anyone who complains, they'll say to him, if you don't like it here, why don't you go to your own country? But the cabinet overruled Edwin Montagu and issued the Balfour Declaration. So to sum up, so far, we have the Sykes-Picot Agreement and we have the Balfour Declaration, and these are the two main terms of reference for all Arab nationalists from that time until the present day, and are still hugely influential at the symbolic level. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was a symbol of colonial domination, the colonial kava, colonial disregard for the Arabs and their rights. And the Balfour Declaration was symbolic of the introduction by Britain of another element, Zionism, the Zionist movement, into the heartland of the Arab world. The difference was that the Sykes-Picot Agreement was not implemented, whereas the Balfour Declaration was implemented. From the point of view of Britain's interest, the Balfour Declaration was a colossal blunder, one of the worst blunders in British imperial history. But worse was to come, because in 1920, Britain wrote the Balfour Declaration into the League of Nations mandate over Palestine. So what had been just a British promise, declaration which had no standing under international law, became a legally binding international instrument. And under the terms of the mandate, Britain had to fulfill its promise to support the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. After the war, Britain had to confront the incompatible promises that it had made to the three sides. Lawrence of Arabia came up with a solution to the problem. By this time, Lawrence of Arabia was the advisor to the new colonial secretary, Winston Churchill. Lawrence felt very guilty about Britain's betrayal of Hussein the Sharif of Mecca. So he came up with a new plan, which I call the Sharifian plan, which is to take the sons of Hussein the Sharif of Mecca, Faisal and Abdallah, and to put them in charge of client states of the British Empire. So the British procured for Faisal the throne of Iraq after he had been kicked out by the French from Damascus, where he had an independent Arab kingdom. The British kingmakers had a referendum, and they rigged the referendum, and they said that 96% of Iraqis voted for this foreigner from the Hijaz to be the king. So the British rigged the first referendum in the region. And Churchill, by the stroke of his pen, one bright Sunday afternoon, created the Emirate of Transjordan and appointed Abdallah as Emir of Transjordan. But Emir didn't have what these days we call in the academic world tenure. The Emir Abdallah was appointed for a probationary period of 6 months to see how he would shape up, and then he was confirmed in that position as Emir of Transjordan. So there was no room for the Palestinians in these two client states of Britain. And Iraq and Jordan were the two main pillars of Britain's informal empire in the Middle East after the First World War. The Iraqi pillar was knocked out by the revolution in 1958, and Britain witnessed the defenestration of its royal friends in Baghdad, my hometown. But the Jordanian pillar survived the 1958 revolution, and it survived to this day. And today, Jordan is still a very solid and a very close ally of Great Britain. As the mandatory power in Palestine, from the very beginning, Britain favored the Zionists. The first High Commissioner for Palestine was Sir Herbert Samuel, who was a Jew, but more importantly, an ardent Zionist. The Palestinians demanded a democratically elected National Assembly and government. Whitehall rejected all the demands. British High Commissioners made one proposal after another to the two warring communities. All of these proposals were rejected either by one side or by the other side or by both. But the cumulative effect of the way that Britain ran the mandate was to weaken the Arabs and to strengthen the Zionists. So far, I've talked only about Britain, as if the local parties did not really count. But now I must give agency to the local actors. And here we see an interesting contrast in the strategies of the two communities. The Zionists adopted a very subtle and effective gradualist strategy, which said, at every historic juncture, take what's on offer, consolidate, and then come back for more. Whereas Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, the leader of the Palestinian national movement, embarked on a high-risk strategy of all or nothing, and he ended up with nothing. There was also another difference in the attitude towards the great powers. It was always a cardinal tenet of Zionist foreign policy to gain the support of the preeminent Western power of the day. In those days it was Britain. After the Second World War it was America. And this is a tenet that brought rich rewards to the Zionist movement to this day, especially today when President Trump has given Benjamin Netanyahu a free hand to expand settlements and to annex any part of the West Bank that he likes. Whereas the Mufti fell out with the British, he escaped from Palestine, and he threw in his lot with Nazi Germany. It wasn't a very smart move, and he didn't help the Palestinian national movement. In 1936, an Arab revolt broke out against the British and against the Zionist proteges. Major General Bernard Montgomery, Monty for short, was sent to Palestine to crush the revolt. His advisors tried to educate him about the nature of the conflict and the history of the conflict. He didn't want to hear. He gave a straightforward order: kill all the rebels. And that's what the British Army did. It suppressed the Arab revolt with the most incredible brutality, killing thousands of Palestinians, arresting thousands of others, burning villages, and denying any right to assembly or to political parties. So Palestinian society by 1939, by the end of the revolt, was left really weak and fragmented and defenseless. There is an article by the Palestinian historian Rashid Khalidi in a volume that Eugene Rogan, my colleague at the Middle East Center at St. Anthony's College, and I co-edited, called The War for Palestine, Rewriting the History of 1948. And Khalidi argues that the struggle for Palestine was not lost in the late 1940s, but in the late 1930s, after Britain had crushed the Arab revolt, and I find it a very persuasive argument. But this brings me to 1948. There is a great debate about 1948 between the traditional Zionist historians and a small group of us who are called the New Israeli Historians or the revisionist Israeli historians, a small group that included Benny Morris, Ilan Pape, and myself. But in the meantime, Benny Morris has defected and he has veered to the extreme right. So the only remaining new historians are Ilan Pape and myself. But between us, we mounted frontal assault on all the myths that have come to surround the birth of Israel and the First Arab-Israeli War. The only bone of contention that is relevant here is British policy in 1948. The received Zionist wisdom is that as the British mandate for Palestine was approaching its inglorious end, Britain's aim was to frustrate the UN's partition resolution, to arm and encourage its Arab client states to invade Palestine upon expiry of the mandate and to strangle the infant Jewish state at birth. Ilan Pape, in his doctoral thesis at Oxford, which I examined, and then in his book, Britain and Palestine, Britain and the Arab-Israeli conflict, 1948 to 1951, he examined the British document and he concluded that Britain pragmatically accepted the inevitability of a Jewish state. Britain's aim was not to prevent the birth of a Jewish state, but rather to prevent the birth of a Palestinian state. And I developed this theme in my 1988 book, Collusion Across the Jordan, King Abdallah, the Zionist Movement, and the Partition of Palestine. I advanced two theses. The first and main thesis is that in 1947, King Abdallah of Jordan and the Zionist movement reached a tacit agreement to divide up Palestine between themselves at the expense of the Palestinians. And the second thesis is that Britain knew and approved of this conspiracy against the Palestinians. So the key to British policy in 1948 was Greater Transjordan, to support King Abdallah's bid to capture the Arab part of Palestine, the West Bank, and later to annex it to his kingdom. Abdallah was not an independent actor. He was a British client, and the officials in the Foreign Office refer to him as Mr. Bevin's little king. So Mr. Bevin unleashed his little king, Abdallah, who was a born land grabber, to grab the Arab part of Palestine. And 1948 developed into a general land grab. The winners were the Zionists, who expanded the borders of their state beyond the UN partition line, and Abdallah, who grabbed the West Bank and then annexed it to his kingdom. The losers were the Palestinians, who are still without a state of their own. In 1948 occurred the first serious American intervention in the conflict. Immediately after the State of Israel was proclaimed, President Truman recognized the new Jewish state. The British officials were not happy about the American intervention on the side of the Zionists in the conflict. And on the 2nd of June 1948, Sir John Trousdale, a senior official, wrote a memorandum to Secretary of State Ernest Bevin, the Foreign Secretary. In it, he complained that the Americans had supported the Zionists, and he said that the Americans were responsible for the emergence of a gangster state with, quote, a thoroughly unscrupulous set of leaders. I used to think that this judgment is too harsh, but the last three Israeli assaults on Gaza, the last three vicious assaults on civilians, on the people of Gaza, an American complicity in these vicious assaults on civilians at least reopens the question. I'm now going to fast forward to Tony Blair. Tony Blair was a Christian Zionist and a completely uncritical supporter of Israel. He is, I'm not sure whether he still is, he probably still is, an honorary patron of the Jewish National Fund UK. And as the name suggests, the Jewish National Fund only caters for Jews. It doesn't cater for Muslims or for Arabs. The crunch came in 2003 when the American neocons wanted to invade Iraq and topple the Ba'ath regime. So the declared aim of the invasion was to free Iraq of the weapons of mass destruction that we later learned he did not possess. An undeclared aim of that war was to remove a long-term Iraqi threat to Israel. And another undeclared aim of the invasion of Iraq was to resolve the Palestinian problem on Israel's terms. The slogan was that the road to Jerusalem leads through Baghdad. And the thinking was that if Saddam Hussein is toppled, a major source of financial and political support for the Palestinian revolution will dry up. The Palestinians will be left weak and isolated, and they would have no choice but to accept peace on Israel's terms. As you will know, there was widespread report to the war in Iraq in this country, especially in Blair's own party, in the Labour Party. And in his speech to the House of Commons on the 18th of March 2003, Blair said, used the popularity of the Palestinian cause in order to justify the invasion of Iraq. He said there are two issues in Middle East politics. One is Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. The other is the Palestinian problem. More urgent is to disarm Iraq. And I promise you that after we've done that, we'll turn all our attention to bring justice to the Palestinians. So he swayed the vote in favor of the war on Iraq. He promised to do something for the Palestinians, and he never did anything for them. Iraq was invaded. It was a catastrophe at every level. It was one of the worst blunders in British imperial history. And the invasion of Iraq was the direct result of the emergence of ISIS years later. In 2007, immediately after stepping down as Prime Minister, Blair became the quartet envoy to the Middle East, the peace envoy. The quartet consists of America, Russia, the United Nations, and European Union. And Blair was an American appointee. His only two qualifications for the job was that he was a neocon. In many ways, he was the worst of the bunch. And secondly, he was an uncritical supporter of Israel. And whenever Blair spoke as the quartet envoy to the region, to me he always sounded like an Israeli official, because he always talked about Israeli security. He never ever mentioned Palestinian rights. The quartet came up with a good plan for peace, the roadmap for a two-state solution, but Israel didn't like the roadmap, and therefore it completely ignored it and sidelined and continued with settlement expansion. So it seems to me that the quartet is useless, that it's just a clever American device for wasting time. One last point about Tony Blair is that he received the Dan David Prize, an Israeli prize. The prize is worth $1 million, and the citation said he got this prize for moral courage and leadership. Well, I may be cynical, but I think that this was Blair's reward for his continuing complicity in Israel's crimes against the Palestinian people. I now come to Theresa May, and I've more or less run out of time, so I'll be brief. Theresa May is another Zionist Prime Minister. In a speech she gave to the Conservative Friends of Israel, which includes 80% of all Tory MPs and the entire cabinet, in her speech she praised Israel as a beacon of democracy and tolerance, as a model of equality for all its equal rights for all its citizens. She denounced BDS, and she said that her government would have no truck for anyone who supports BDS. Britain voted for Security Council Resolution 2334 of the 23rd of December of last year, a resolution on Israel and Palestine, a very strong resolution which stated categorically that all settlements on the West Bank are illegal, and called on Israel to immediately and completely cease all settlement activity. The Obama administration abstained. 14 other members voted for the resolution, including Britain, and the resolution was passed. And Theresa May criticized subsequently John Kerry for a speech he made about the resolution and its significance, and she said it was wrong of him to criticize a democratically elected government of an ally, and it was wrong of him to focus just on the settlement issue. There was a very strong reply from the State Department to say that he dealt with the whole range of impediments to the two-state solution, and not just the settlements, and that Britain voted for this resolution denouncing settlements. So what is Theresa May complaining about? My answer to that question is that she wants to ingratiate himself with President Trump. That's why she has taken such a strong anti-Palestinian and pro-Israeli position. But the upshot is that now Israel enjoys two vetoes in the Security Council, the American veto and the British veto. A few concluding remarks, if I may, although I've exhausted my time. European colonialism has been a decisive factor and a largely negative factor in shaping the history, the modern history of the Middle East. In Palestine, Britain played a decisive part in enabling a minority, and enabling a minority of 10% to start the systematic takeover of the entire country. It's a sad story of double standards, of broken promises, and of betrayals from Balfour to Blair and beyond. 100 years ago, the Palestinians were up against British colonialism, allied to Zionist settler colonialism. Today, the Palestinians are up against the most aggressive right-wing and racist government in Israel's history, a government which enjoys the unqualified support of the Trump administration. So the Palestinians are engaged in the last anti-colonial struggle in the world today. The odds are against them, but the struggle continues, and for my part, I'm confident that eventually it will end in justice for the Palestinians. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Professor. I think we'll open the floor now for a quick 10-minute Q&A. I think we'll take 2 questions at a time. So if you'd like to ask a question, you raise your hand, and we'll try to take as many questions as possible. One question over there. 2 seconds, the microphone's up.
Thank you. Moin Yassin from Global Vision 2000. We're a think tank, independent think tank. One key dimension on your analysis, which I think needs further highlighting, is the internal, it's okay blaming the outsider, Western colonialism and imperialism. However, this cannot happen without the collusion of the victims and their leaders. And I would argue the solution at the end of your diagnosis is okay saying, oh, it's going to be a happy ending, like a fairy tale. You didn't mention how. And I'm afraid it's quite superficial analysis given the stakes involved here. So coming back to the point about treachery, I'm talking about treachery within the Arab and Muslim camp. That has been a running sore since the Arabs, as some Muslim historians talk about, stabbing the Ottoman Turks in the back, rightly or wrongly, and then many other examples of, well, you mentioned the Abdullah, for instance, yeah, in Transjordan and so on. So there has been a running story of false Muslim leadership and indeed betrayal, and that has got to be resolved. And obviously I think that is an internal Muslim to Muslim issue. And I'll just stop there. I just want to raise that because it hasn't been mentioned. And finally, the second point is eschatology. This is a very important point. We had 2 conferences in London last year on a study of end times. You mentioned Christian Zionism and indeed Jewish Zionism, if you want to call it. But to understand all of this, I think we need to understand the new discipline of eschatology, and it has been barely looked at. That's it, thanks.
I'd like to just ask if we can keep questions to 30 seconds maximum, please. Q&A, we don't have much time for that, so please set your questions up there.
Sorry, I'll try and keep it brief. I'm Austin Harney, I'm from the Public Commercial Services Union. We're affiliated to the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. And we led the campaign at the TUC conference, by the way, PCS, to ensure that support BDS sanctions against secular goods, etc. The question I want to ask is more about education, because in the days of the Greater London Council, we were educating schools, universities about the injustice of apartheid, which the British news media condemned. We also set up sections about Irish education, Irish history as well. I'm actually from an Irish family, and I think that's very important. What I want to emphasise to everybody here in the audience, by the way, Balfour Declaration, he had another name which wasn't known. His name was Bloody Balfour when he was ruling Ireland under Salisbury, evicting Irish people left, right and centre, clamping down on the Land League. He was actually siding with the absentee landlords, very similar to the settlers on the West Bank. Lloyd George, he partitioned Ireland, made 6 county states, which is causing problems today, to this very, very day. Tony Blair, who created the Good Friday Agreement, that is a complete mess, that's going nowhere. There are people absolutely opposed to the peace process, and the internment is backing the north of Ireland all over again. So the question I wanted to ask, sorry, I'll keep it brief as you promised, education. Nelson Mandela said, if you educate society, you'll change the world. That's what we need to do. We need to have a future government that's going to invest in schools, councils, education. We should promote Palestinian History Month, I think, because we do the Black History Month. And I think that's what we need to do, educate the injustices of what's going on right now and the history of going back to that.
The first question was about the Arab part, the part that the Arab states have played in the loss of Palestine. And it's a very valid point. I focused on the colonial power and on the 2 local actors, and I ignored the surrounding Arab countries. So what I would say about the Arab part in the loss of Palestine is this, that Arab support for the Palestinians, with a bit of history first, the neighboring Arab states got involved in the conflict in Palestine on the side of the Palestinians in the late 1930s, and they have remained involved to different degrees until the present day. But it wasn't, the Arab position can be seen at 2 levels. The declaratory level, which is total support for the Palestinian cause, and the operational level, where there were national agendas. And it's the national agendas that superseded the collective Arab commitment to the Palestinians. And the 1948 war is a very good example of this phenomenon, because all the Arabs intervened in Palestine, the Arab states, for the liberation of Palestine. But in fact, they each had their different agendas. And it was the inability of the Arab states to coordinate their diplomatic and their military strategy that was largely responsible for the Nakba, for the catastrophe that overwhelmed it. The second question was about education, and here I think the speaker was very eloquent about the importance of education, and I also think that the parallel you drew with Lloyd George's record and Balfour's record in Northern Ireland is very, very similar. The British Empire always practiced a policy of divide and rule. It did that in Ireland, it did that in Palestine, and in the same year, in 1947, it did that in India. In India, Britain cut and run and left a terrible civil war to take place. So education is very important. Raising awareness of Britain's role in the loss of Palestine is all important, and the public in Britain is not aware of the role that we have played in dispossessing the Palestinians, and the role that the British government still plays in unqualified support for Israel political support, diplomatic support, trade, and arms sales to Israel on a very major scale. So education is all important, and I'd like to draw your attention to an educational project called the Balfour Project, which is online. It's well worth visiting the website, and it includes a 15-minute film on the history of the Balfour Declaration and every phase in the subsequent history of this declaration.
Thank you very much. I think we'll take 2 more questions, if that's okay. Yeah?
It's quite a simplistic question, really. Why are everybody in the world seemingly terrified of criticising Israel? Why is it just glaringly obvious that every country, every business, the second Israel is mentioned in any kind of, someone criticises them, everyone just says, I didn't say that, no. What has Israel got on the world? Why have they so much control on people, how they speak? This thing with anti-Semitism, attacking anyone who, especially in England at the moment, Labour politicians saying they're anti-Semitic. What is the power? Why are we all frightened of them? Why? They're only a tiny little state. Why?
Professor Avi, thank you for your talk. My question, in your closing remarks, you mentioned justice for Palestinians. My question is, how would that come about? What would that look like? And more importantly, more specifically, how does that reconcile with the settler population living in the West Bank who are beyond a single generation now?
I'm going to go a bit over time. Just take one more question. Yeah.
My question is really just to round off everything. My question is, what would be your response to Theresa May's comment this weekend that the British people should be proud of the Balfour Declaration?
And I'm not, and I've heard people say I'm not, so that's the answer to Theresa May. The first question was a very interesting question. Why are people so afraid of Israel? And my answer is twofold. The first part of the answer is the Holocaust. The Holocaust happened not in the Middle East, not in the Arab world. It happened in the heartland of Christian Europe. There was no anti-Semitism in the Arab lands. Anti-Semitism is a European phenomenon. I was born in Baghdad in 1945. I was an Arab Jew. That was my first identity. My family had lived in Iraq, possibly since the Babylonian exile 2.5 millennia ago. And there was a long history of harmony between Muslims and Jews, Muslims and Christians in Iraq, until the emergence of the Zionist movement, and more specifically until 1948. The Iraqi army participated in the war for Palestine, and then there was a backlash against the Jews, and peaceful coexistence became impossible because Israel was created. And when I was 5 years old, my family moved to Israel. We were part of a huge exodus which completely terminated an ancient Jewish community in this particular Arab land. So the European countries had a sense of guilt about the Holocaust, which happened in Central Europe. But the Palestinians were not guilty, yet they were made to pay for the sins of Christian Europe in persecuting the Jews. And this is why A country like Germany, to this day, is very, very hesitant to say anything critical about Israel, the sense of guilt. The other factor is the power of the Israel lobby. We all know how powerful the Israel lobby is in America, and that the influence it has over American policy, not just towards Israel and towards the conflict, but across the board, American policy towards the entire region. Less well known is the power of the lobby, the Israel lobby in this country. But there was a very good 4-part educational program on Al Jazeera last month. It was called The Lobby, and it was documented the role of the Israeli embassy in interfering in the British democratic process to influence, to promote support for Israel, uncritical support for Israel, and to discredit and to undermine and to character assassinate critics of Israel and supporters of the Arab cause. So the second part of my answer to you is the power of the Israel lobby in America and in Britain. And the last question was about justice for the Palestinians, what form it would take. I'm not concerned with what form it would take, whether it be one state or two states. What is important is justice for the Palestinians, Palestinian rights, because the world has moved on from nation states, from nationalism, from national borders, to an emphasis on rights, which are universal. And in this particular case, it's individual rights, the human rights of the Palestinians, and their collective right to national self-determination. That's what's at issue, Palestinian rights. What form it would take is secondary. It can take the form of two states, it can take the form of a confederation between the West Bank and Jordan, and it could take the form of one state, one binational state from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. This is the option that I support most, because it's a noble vision of a secular state with equal rights for all its citizens. You may say this is rather idealistic, this is very far-fetched, and maybe it is, because of the geopolitics of this conflict. The Palestinians are the victims of the cruel geopolitics of the region, and they are still victims today because they have, as I said, America and Britain on the side. So I don't have much hope from Western governments to bring justice to the Palestinians. I pin my hopes on BDS, on boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Because that is civil society. That is a global grassroots movement which is fighting Israeli apartheid and fighting for equal rights of the Palestinians. And it's gradually gaining support across the globe. It's focusing a light on Israel as an apartheid state and as a colonial state in the 21st century. And my hope is in the long term, this movement would gain further and further momentum, and eventually it will be able to influence the policies of Western governments in a direction that will bring justice to the Palestinians. So that's the best hope that we have for the justice for the Palestinians.